The British Empire did not collapse on a battlefield. It collapsed the moment it could no longer finance its own war in December 1940. In the dark and freezing December of 1940, the future of Western civilization hung by a thread that was fraying with every passing hour. The Battle of Britain had been won in the skies, but the Blitz was raging in the streets. London was burning. The Luftwaffe was pounding the industrial heartlands of Coventry and Liverpool. On the map of the world, the British Empire still looked vast, a splash of pink covering a quarter of the globe. But inside the war rooms of Whitehall, the men who ran the British government knew a terrifying secret they dared not whisper to the public. The empire was not just bleeding soldiers, it was bleeding to death financially. Once the money ran out, the war would not pause to let it recover. Once the reserves were exhausted, every decision Britain made would be priced in dollars it did not control. Winston Churchill, the man whose voice was rallying the free world, sat at his desk in the underground cabinet war rooms to write one of the most important letters of his life. It was addressed to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the President of the United States. Churchill was a master of the English language, a man who could turn a phrase into a weapon. But in this letter, he had to perform a delicate and humiliating dance. He had to tell the leader of the world's richest neutral nation that Great Britain was completely and utterly broke. It was the banker of the 19th century, the workshop of the world, and the empire that had defeated Napoleon. By admitting that, he surrendered the last leverage Britain possessed over the price of its own survival. The letter was long and detailed, and it described the strategic situation, the U-boat peril in the Atlantic, and the desperate need for destroyers and aircraft. But the sting was in the tail. Churchill wrote that the moment was approaching when the British Treasury would no longer be able to pay cash for the supplies it needed to survive. He wrote that the British people would fight on the beaches and the landing grounds, but they could not fight without ammunition. They could no longer afford to buy it. It was a plea for survival. And it was an admission of insolvency that closed the last illusion that the empire could finance its own war. Outside conditions became the only path forward. To understand how the wealthiest empire in history reached this point of destitution, we have to look at the ruthless economics of total war. When the war began in September 1939, Britain was still a financial titan. It held billions of dollars in gold reserves and owned a massive portfolio of overseas investments. British citizens owned railroads in Argentina, copper mines in Chile, and vast industrial concerns in the United States. The city of London was the hub of global insurance and shipping. But the war that Hitler launched was different from any war that had come before. It was a war of machines, and it consumed steel, oil, aluminum, and rubber at a rate that defied pre-war calculations. This forced Britain to import almost everything, just as the European continent was sealed off. The option of self-sustained mobilization disappeared. The blockade of Europe meant Britain could no longer trade with its neighbors. It had to look across the Atlantic to the United States for its survival. That survival came with conditions already written into American law. At this stage in the war, the United States was officially neutral. The American public was isolationist. They remembered the First World War, when American boys had died in European mud, and they were determined not to be dragged into another foreign slaughter. Congress had passed the Neutrality Acts to keep America out of the war. Those acts contained a specific clause known as cash and carry. Belligerent nations like Britain could buy American supplies, but they had to pay for them in cash immediately. They had to transport them on their own ships. There would be no loans, and there would be no credit. The Americans would sell the weapons of war, but they demanded gold on the barrelhead before the crates left the dock in New York. Without gold, there would be no deliveries. For the first year of the war, Britain drained its treasury to meet these demands. Gold reserves were liquidated. In a secret operation known as Operation Fish, the British government loaded the entire gold wealth of the nation onto battleships and fastliners. It shipped it across the dangerous Atlantic to vaults in Canada. It was the largest movement of physical wealth in history. Billions of dollars in gold bars and negotiable securities sent into exile to satisfy American bill collectors. By late 1940, The gold was gone, and the liquid cash was gone. The British Purchasing Commission in Washington had contracts for planes and tanks sitting on its desks that it could not sign. Treasury officials in London informed them there were no dollars left to honor them. Without dollars, those contracts were dead paper. When Roosevelt received Churchill's letter, he understood the stakes. In understanding them, he faced his own narrowing set of choices. If Britain fell, the United States would be next. But he could not simply give money to Britain. American law forbade it, and the American public would revolt. He needed a way to help Britain that looked like a hard-headed business arrangement rather than charity. He needed to shift leverage without appearing to break the law. From that constraint, the idea of Lend-Lease was born. It was a mechanism that would commit the United States to supply while binding Britain to terms it could not later undo. From that point, Britain could no longer choose the price of its own survival. Roosevelt explained Lend-Lease to the press with a folksy analogy about lending a neighbor a garden hose when his house was on fire. He promised its return when the flames were out. It sounded simple, generous, and neighborly. But the negotiations that unfolded behind closed doors in Washington were not neighborly. They were closer to a foreclosure proceeding between a bank and a bankrupt client. And once that posture was adopted, there was no returning to the fiction of equals. Foreclosure logic does not permit shared control. Henry Morgenthau Jr., the American Treasury Secretary, was a staunch anti-fascist who wanted to see Britain defeat Hitler. But he was also the guardian of the American taxpayer. Before the United States would extend aid, he insisted Britain prove it had stripped itself of every last asset. He demanded a full audit of the British Empire. He wanted a list of every asset owned by the British government and by private British citizens anywhere in the world. He wanted to see the books opened to a foreign power. In making that demand, he transformed an alliance into an examination. It removed Britain's ability to shield any remaining leverage. The British negotiators, led by Sir Frederick Phillips, were stunned. They were treated as a failed company in receivership. Phillips argued that Britain had already sold its gold. He argued that selling long-term investments during wartime would be a fire sale yielding pennies on the dollar. He argued that stripping Britain of its overseas income would leave the country destitute after the war. Morgenthau did not bend. His instructions were clear. No aid would flow until Britain had scraped the bottom of the barrel. If Britain still possessed assets in the United States, then the American taxpayer would not subsidize the war while British wealth remained intact. Every retained asset weakened Britain's case for assistance. The most painful symbol of this forced liquidation was the American Viscose Corporation. It was a massive industrial giant, the largest manufacturer of rayon and artificial silk in the United States. It was owned by a British company, Courtaulds, and was a jewel in the crown of British overseas investment. It generated millions of dollars in dividends that flowed back to London and helped balance Britain's trade deficit. Morgenthau identified American Viscose as a target and told the British negotiators it had to be sold. The proceeds would be deposited into the U.S. Treasury to pay for existing weapons orders. This converted a revenue stream into a one-time payment that could not be reclaimed. The British resisted. They knew the company was worth over $100 million. To sell it in a rush during war was financial suicide. But Morgenthau held the leverage. The Lend-Lease bill was moving through Congress under attack from isolationists who claimed Britain was secretly rich. Morgenthau needed proof of British sacrifice. He delivered an ultimatum that closed the door. Sell American Viscose or Lend-Lease dies in committee. This would eliminate the only channel through which Britain could continue to fight. On March 15, 1941, under immense pressure from Washington, the British government seized the American Viscose Corporation under emergency war powers. It forced its sale. The transaction was handled by American investment bankers who knew Britain had no choice. And because the sale was distressed, they priced it, knowing Britain had no alternative buyer. The company was sold for roughly $54 million. It was barely half its estimated value. The British government reimbursed Courtaulds in pounds back in London. This added to its own internal debt. The dollars went straight into the U.S. Treasury to pay for rifles and aircraft engines. In that transaction, the special relationship acquired its true shape. Britain was not a partner. It was a junior entity being stripped of assets to finance its survival. Once the sale was complete, the dividend stream that once supported Britain's balance of payments was gone permanently. What had been recurring dollar income became a single transaction. Future import capacity narrowed with it. And with that income gone, Britain's dependence on American supply deepened. The next negotiation began from a weaker base. But the liquidation did not stop with industrial holdings. It extended into geopolitics. Britain was desperate for destroyers, as German U-boats sank merchant ships faster than they could be replaced. Churchill begged Roosevelt for 50 old World War I-era destroyers. They were rusting in American naval yards. Roosevelt agreed, but he did not give them. He traded them. In exchange, the United States received 99-year leases on British naval and air bases. These stretched from Newfoundland to the Bahamas, Jamaica, St. Lucia, Trinidad, and British Guiana. Britain handed over a strategic footprint covering the Atlantic and the Caribbean. It did so for ships that were barely seaworthy. It was a geopolitical fire sale. Long-term strategic control was traded for short-term survival. Once the leases were signed, those positions would project American power for a century. They limited Britain's post-war freedom to shape its own sphere. By the time Lend-Lease was signed into law in March 1941, Britain had been stripped clean. The gold was gone. U.S. investments were sold, bases were leased, and the Treasury was empty. Publicly, Lend-Lease was hailed as the arsenal of democracy. Without it, Britain would likely have starved into submission. But the financial architecture embedded in its clauses ensured that after the war, Britain would emerge as a debtor. America would emerge as creditor. Article 7, written in dense diplomatic language, required Britain to dismantle its imperial preference system after the war. In signing it, Britain agreed to tear down the tariff walls that bound its empire together. It agreed to open colonial markets to American goods. In doing so, it signed away the economic coherence of its trading bloc. It committed its post-war recovery to open competition without tariff protection. After Article 7, Britain could not rebuild its balance sheet inside its own empire. The British negotiators fought Article 7, knowing it would end the empire as an economic unit. But the bombers were overhead. The U-boats were in the Atlantic, and the cash was gone. They signed, and with that signature, the post-war landscape narrowed into inevitability. Dismantling imperial preference meant there would be no sheltered market to rebuild behind. As 1941 turned to 1942 and the United States entered the war after Pearl Harbor, the alliance became military equals. But financially, the gap widened. American industry, fueled by government spending and untouched by bombs, exploded in size and efficiency. Britain converted every factory to war production and abandoned its export markets in Latin America and Asia. American companies stepped into those markets, while British factories made Spitfires. American factories made Spitfires and refrigerators and radios and cars for global sale. By 1944, the world's gold reserves had shifted from London to Fort Knox. The world's reserve system had shifted from London to Washington. Britain was left without the monetary leverage it once wielded. Yet the final humiliation remained ahead. Britain believed its sacrifice would earn generosity. It assumed Lend-Lease would continue through transition, and it assumed there would be time to adjust. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered. London erupted in celebration. 7 days later in Washington, President Harry Truman terminated Lend-Lease abruptly and without transition. Ships carrying wheat and meat to Liverpool were ordered to turn around. Aid stopped instantly. There was no grace period, and the lifeline was severed. With it, the last buffer between wartime distortion and peacetime reckoning disappeared. Britain discovered it had been operating without working capital. Without transitional financing, the war economy had no mechanism to fund peace. John Maynard Keynes examined the numbers and saw catastrophe. Britain was importing half its food and nearly all its raw materials. It had been paying with Lend-Lease dollars that no longer existed, and without them, bankruptcy was immediate. He calculated a financial Dunkirk: default, ration cuts, unemployment, and social collapse. There was only one option left. Britain had to beg. Without external financing, there was no way to bridge even a single month. In September 1945, a sick and exhausted Keynes traveled to Washington seeking a $6 billion grant. It was a retroactive payment for Britain's wartime sacrifice. He framed it as justice and found instead a hardened Congress, wary of funding a new British Labour government intent on nationalization. The American negotiators offered not a grant, but a $3.75 billion loan on commercial terms, with interest. It came with conditions designed to dismantle the last protections of Britain's economic system. Most notably, sterling convertibility. This locked future stability to American-defined rules, and within 1 year, Britain would make the pound fully convertible into dollars. Anyone holding sterling could exchange it for U.S. currency. The Americans framed it as free trade. In practice, it threatened to smash the sterling area. This was the closed loop that had forced colonies and partners to spend pounds within the British system. Keynes warned that once convertibility began, holders of sterling would rush to exchange it for dollars. They would do so to buy superior American goods. He predicted a run that would drain reserves in weeks, but the alternative was starvation. Parliament accepted the loan. This bound the currency to exposure it could not defend without draining its remaining reserves. Keynes died months later, his fight unfinished. In July 1947, Britain made sterling convertible. The result was immediate and brutal. Countries unloaded their pounds for dollars, and the loan funds evaporated. Within a month, hundreds of millions were lost. After 5 weeks, Britain suspended convertibility in humiliation and admitted failure. The reserves had been drained, and the illusion of financial independence disappeared. Britain was left more dependent on American tolerance than before the experiment began. The consequences were geopolitical. In February 1947, Britain informed the United States it could no longer support Greece and Turkey. It was leaving the Mediterranean vacuum to Washington. Without funds, there was no capacity to project force. The Truman Doctrine followed, marking the formal transfer of global responsibility. Britain devalued the pound in 1949 from $4.86 to $2.80. This acknowledged economic weakness and reduced the international purchasing power of its citizens overnight. The Anglo-American loan of 1946 was repaid over 60 years. The final payment was made on December 29, 2006, decades after victory parades. British taxpayers were still paying the debt incurred to survive. The empire it once sustained had dissolved. Britain had defeated Germany militarily, but bankrupted itself economically. The United States doubled its economy, held 2/3 of the world's gold, dismantled imperial trade preferences, and acquired bases and influence through contract rather than conquest. It did not conquer the British Empire with armies. It bought it through a forced liquidation enforced by financial leverage. Once that leverage was exercised, the transfer of power did not reverse. When Churchill wrote to Roosevelt in December 1940, he saved his country from Hitler. He also set in motion the liquidation of an empire. There was no other choice. The deal secured survival and surrendered the future. Britain emerged as a moral giant and an economic pygmy. Its inheritance was spent to purchase freedom. The empire did not collapse in a single dramatic fall. It was sold piece by piece to pay the bill. For the British people, the legacy of 1941 remained a scar on the national psyche. It created a lingering sense of decline and fueled the special relationship. It was always a polite euphemism for dependency. When Winston Churchill wrote that letter to Roosevelt in December 1940, he saved his country from Hitler. But he also signed the deed of sale. He traded the empire for survival. But it was a deal that had to be made. There was no other choice. But the cost was the future. Britain emerged from the war as a moral giant, but an economic pygmy. It had spent its inheritance to buy freedom for Europe. But in the cold, hard light of economics, it was a liquidation. The empire didn't fall. Its assets were liquidated. Its markets were opened, and its debt was serviced for decades to pay the bill.